Sorry I'm late, everybody. I hope you guys are doing well. I couldn't get Discord to work, and without Discord, my PNG doesn't work. Discord just decided to be a butt today, so we will be ending around 5:30ish this time because I want to keep the hour-long sessions. So I hope you guys are doing well. Hope you're having a great day and staying hydrated, have eaten something, and we're just gonna jump right into it. We're gonna continue reading the horror book Stolen Tongues today. So if you guys haven't been here for the past couple streams for that, I recommend going to watch my VODs of it on my YouTube channel to catch up. Otherwise, you'll be pretty confused. So we are gonna jump right in. Let me switch over to my scary stories section and we'll change the music over to this. I am just going to hop right into it. After every page, I will be looking up to read chat, so I don't want to take you out of it too much, but I still want to keep up with chat, so here we go. Avonwood is a lily-white suburb, around 30 minutes outside the Rockies. Tucked safely within it is the home Faye and her older sister grew up in, a place that is now too big for her aging parents. We got there after a visit to the ER. The doctor ran a few tests and deemed Faye's condition to not be the result of extreme stress, not food poisoning, as she had jokingly insisted during the lulls of her nausea. That night, the four of us sat down around the huge living room. We propped Faye up hospital style on the couch with pillows and blankets. Greg was sprawled out in his $3,000 recliner. A relaxing fire crackled nearby. Faye had managed to keep down some soup, only after being repeatedly assured that I had no hand in its preparation. After the three of them grew tired of mocking me, the conversation became more serious. Lynn, Faye's mom, was horrified at the stories we recounted of our trip. Greg barely showed any emotion at all. "Did you guys ever experience anything weird up there?" Faye asked, point blank. "I mean, there must be a reason you haven't been up in years." Initially, Lynn avoided answering, but Faye cornered her mother with direct questions, and eventually she caved. "I was just never comfortable up there," she replied. "I'd heard a few things, and that was it for me. Nothing ever happened, not like what you're telling us." "What do you mean, heard?" I asked. "Heard stories from other people? Or heard things outside?" I watched Lynn's eyes closely. They darted all around, but never at me. She glanced quickly at her husband, who cleared his throat and removed his reading glasses. "Bedtime for me," he said. "Sorry, kids. You woke my old ass up too early." Greg kissed Faye on the forehead and then abruptly retired for the night, leaving the three of us alone downstairs. "I'm so glad he was able to get up that road," Lynn replied with a smile, trying to change the subject. Faye sat up with a grunt and cast her impatient eyes onto Lynn. "Mom." "It was nothing," her mother whispered. She set down the mug of hot chocolate she held and wrapped herself tighter in the blanket. "Just, creepy things about the place. That's all." After a few more minutes of our prodding, Lynn became visibly upset. Tears welled in her eyes, and a look of guilt swept over her face. She kept picking at her fingernails and apologizing to us, swearing she never thought anything bad would happen. Then out came a story that horrified us. Nearly 30 years ago, in the youth of their marriage, Faye's parents bought the cabin from some old friends. Those folks were named Jennifer and Tom, and they lived in Orchard Valley, deep within the Colorado Rockies. When their daughter died in childhood of leukemia, they couldn't bear to live in the same house anymore. The couple bought land on a nearby Pale Peak and built a cabin. Tom was a big outdoorsman, and was especially fond of the mountain for its solitude and its astonishing views of the Rockies. He collected arrowheads and all sorts of historical relics he found on his hikes, and made friends with all the locals. He seemed to be healing from the loss of his only child. But after a while, Jennifer began complaining to Tom about weird experiences in the cabin. She suffered recurring dreams of her husband being dragged out of the bedroom and off into the woods at night. The dreams grew more bizarre and horrific with time, until she eventually began to question her own sanity. Eventually, Jennifer's nightmares culminated with her walking barefoot into the woods, where she'd find Tom's flayed body pinned up in the trees like some macabre work of art. The dreams led to insomnia and a fear of sleep, which exasperated the depression she already bore. The things got worse. Sometimes, when Tom was at work in the valley, Jennifer would hear her daughter calling out to her from the edge of the forest. The voice terrified Jennifer and slowly drove her mad until she suffered a breakdown and begged her husband to leave. He resisted for a while, and the psychiatrist changed Jennifer's medication several times. But nothing happened. But nothing stopped the horrible dreams or the voice outside. Tom finally requested a transfer to Las Vegas, and then the couple hastily sold the cabin, never to return. 2 years later, he unceremoniously hanged himself in their garage. He never left a note. Faye and I were shocked to hear such a dark history of the little place. The grim tale had me momentarily doubting my conviction that ghosts did not exist, and Faye reacted with unmitigated anger toward her mother. "How could you send us up to a place like that?" she hissed, trying to keep her voice down. Lynn cowered in her seat. "Honey, we stayed there many times over the years. It was our vacation house for a long time, and I never experienced anything like that. No voices, no dreams, nothing. If I didn't think it was safe, there's no way I would send you up there." Faye's glare did not relent. Her mother pressed on with her defense. Jennifer and Tom were dealing with the death of their child, sweetheart. Of course weird things happen to them. It's a traumatic experience. It can drive you crazy. There aren't any ghosts on that mountain, just the painful memories that people carry around with them. "Then why did you never feel comfortable there?" Faye asked. Lynn shrugged. "Once you know the story, it's just a little creepy, I guess. You're always expecting something to happen." "But you guys bought the place knowing the story," Faye replied. No, we didn't know for a long time. Tom and Jen never even told us. We had to find out from the locals." "What about Greg?" I asked, trying to cut Faye off before she could chastise her mother any further. Lynn sighed and slouched deeper into the ludicrously cushy sofa. I was almost angrier at the decadence of their home than their decision to send us to Pale Peak. What did I miss? Not much. They're just at Faye's parents' house talking about the history of the cabin. It belonged to their old friends who the wife of their friends kept hearing things, having horrible nightmares in that cabin until they sold it and left, and the husband hanged himself 2 years later. "Your father doesn't like it there either," she replied, looking directly at Faye. "Remember when you were little and Dad was talking in his sleep a lot?" "Yes." "Well, it kind of started up there at the cabin," Lynn said. She dropped her gaze to her lap. The admission reignited the fire in Faye's eyes. "Just like Jennifer," she said angrily. "No, not like that. Your dad always had nightmares before you were born. But his were gone for a long, long time and came back on the mountain for some reason. I always say it's because he confronted Tom about what we learned. It just affected him. I think Jennifer's story reminded your father of his own bad dreams, that's all. And that's hardly a reason to prevent our daughters from using our vacation home." Faye became quiet and pensive, probably recalling her own nightmare at the cabin. The fire suddenly popped, causing all three of us to jump. After a moment, Faye and I caught eyes. "What did he dream?" we both asked at the same time. Lynn hesitated and looked over her shoulder at the staircase. After a moment she said, "You can never repeat this to him. He'd be embarrassed. And furious, of course." We nodded. "One night, when we were staying on the mountain, he started screaming in the dark. When he woke up, he told me that all his buddies who got killed in the war, they were inside the room with us, all maimed and rotten, just sitting on the bed or standing over him, watching us sleep." A cold, tingly feeling spread down my back. I tried to hide the goosebumps that popped up on my arms. Faye looked as if she already knew, corroborating what she told me at the cabin about his sleep-talking when she was little. She hugged her knees to her chest nervously. "He was so upset he didn't talk almost all the next day, and didn't sleep the next night," Lynn continued. "So we left, and that was the last time we stayed the night. We made day trips to do upkeep and remodeling from time to time, but your father refused to ever sleep there again. But he was fine with us going? Faye asked loudly, incensed over this whole conversation. No, he wasn't, Lynn replied. But you know your dad, he doesn't like to talk. And didn't want to explain himself. Plus, he knew you had Felix there to take care of you. I'm so sorry, honey. Lynn, if you don't mind me asking, I said, again trying to head Faye off. Why did you guys keep the cabin all this time? If you never use it, why not sell it? Well, Lynn said, property value around Orchid Valley had quadrupled in the last 15 years. Greg always says it's going to be the new Aspen. Probably wise to hang on to the place until we're ready to liquidate it when we retire in a few years. I'm really sorry, both of you. I don't know what really happened up there, but I'm glad you're okay. And with that, Lynn touched my hand and cupped Faye's cheek. She gathered herself and went upstairs to bed. Faye was still furious with her parents later that night, but was also creeped out by the story her mother had told. She insisted on me staying in her old bedroom with her, despite my offer to sleep on the couch. I wanted Faye to get a full night's rest and be on the mend as soon as possible, but she refused to be left alone. For an hour she vented her frustrations to me and behind a closed door, but soon became nauseous again and fell into a restless sleep. While I scrolled through the news on my phone, Faye began mumbling her dreams out loud. Instead of waking her up, I listened quietly, hoping that she'd reveal something useful that might explain what was going on in her mind. Instead, she answered more questions, just like at the cabin when she slept-talked to the strange figure outside. Never, no, I wouldn't. Up in the snow, up there. I can't. Why his name? I don't know you. Why? Down in the hole. No, it's Felix. Felix, yes. The feeling of being naked and exposed came over me. Someone was coaxing Faye into divulging things about herself and me, someone in her own subconscious mind. This freaked me out so much that I felt the urge to shake her awake and demand an explanation, but I knew that she'd never remember what she was saying or who she was talking to. I convinced myself that letting Faye rest was the best way to distance herself from the experiences on Pale Peak. Hopefully the terror she brought home from there would be washed away by a week of good sleep. But hours later, near the approach of dawn, Faye sat straight up in bed and sucked in a huge breath. The sound woke me up, and I instinctively grabbed the trash can I'd set near the bed, preparing to catch a volley of barf. Instead, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. With her eyes still closed, she looked right into my face and said, "Tell the man in the hall he needs to leave." Petrified, I slipped away from her grasp and peeked out the door into the long hallway. There was no one. For the first time in ages, I thought of Carrot the parrot. When I shut the door and turned around, Faye was horizontal again. I was so weirded out that I couldn't fall back asleep. I read the news on my phone for hours, quietly waiting for the sun to come up. Sip of water. Greg was up bright and early the next morning. I could hear him shuffling around downstairs, talking softly on his cell phone and moving back and forth between the garage and the kitchen. He mentioned something about Pale Peak. Faye was out cold and had a bunch for hours, hopefully because her illness had passed. I crept down the hallway and tried to pick up on Greg's conversation. "Nothing in particular," he said. "Just, poke around, make sure it's all locked up. I don't need anybody messing around in there." After a few moments, he laughed and added, If it burns down, it's on you. 10-4, buddy. Owe you one." I descended the stairs and headed to the pantry for cereal as if I hadn't been listening, but the stupid look on my face instantly gave me away. Greg was a mind-reading Black Ops kind of guy anyway. He knew what I was up to. "Ranger," he said, dropping his phone into his bathrobe pocket and taking a sip of coffee. "Just gonna check on the place. I figure you kids got loopy and a gas leak up there. Pipes were laid in the 70s, I didn't bother pretending to agree. "Wasn't a leak," I said, shoveling kicks into my mouth. "There's someone up there in the woods." Greg palmed the lighter he was sitting on the counter near me. that was sitting on the counter near me. He shrugged and headed to the patio door. "Whoever it was," I called across the room. "They were talking to your daughter from outside the window, in her sleep." Greg stopped at the door just for a moment, then pushed it open and went outside. Faye and I spent our last day in Colorado with her parents. We watched the movies, traded cheery stories, and generally tried to pretend that our visit had been an unremarkable one. That evening, Greg and Lynn dropped us off at the airport. Faye slept the entire flight home. Despite her lifelong parasomnia, she was adept at falling asleep virtually anywhere. I, on the other hand, am a nervous wreck on airplanes, and barely managed to operate my iPod. I clutched her limp hand for the duration of the trip, and occasionally looked at her eyelids. Beneath them, her eyes rolled and darted to and fro, up and down, toward me and away. Again, I found myself wondering what was going on in her sleeping mind. Her lips trembled and mouthed words from time to time, but any sound she might have made were lost in the din of humming engines. We arrived at our house after midnight and went straight to bed. I had never felt so overjoyed to be in our old familiar bed, away from the frigid air and dark memories of the cabin on Pale Peak. Perhaps Faye felt the same way, because from the moment she crawled under the blankets until noon the next morning, she didn't make a sound. I woke up at 9 a.m., which is sleeping in for me. There was a missed call on my phone from Greg. When I called him back, he notified me that Ranger Pike had investigated the cabin with his partner, and it appeared as though someone had tried to break in. It was probably a simple burglary, and most likely committed by some teenagers from the high school down in the valley. He made me promise to tell Faye in order to settle her nerves, then bade me not to worry about what had happened. Something in Greg's voice made me think he was lying. He was too friendly, too warm. His insistence that we try not to focus on such an odd series of events didn't help either. It was too urgent. The moment he hung up the phone, I called the ranger station at the foot of Pale Peak. "Rocky Mountain National Park Service, Pike speaking." "William, it's Felix," I said. "My favorite tourist," he replied in this thick southern drawl. A muddy laugh slid out of his mouth. "Hey, listen," I said, cutting straight to the point. "Can you tell me about the burglary?" "The what? You talking about Hemsville?" "No, I mean the cabin. I just got off the phone with Greg. He said he told him someone broke into his cabin." He said there were teenagers that were messing around up there. Told me not to worry?" William paused for a second too long. "Right, the burglary. Yeah, sorry. Coffee maker's out. Ain't woken up my brain yet. Cabin's fine. It's crap, isn't it?" I interrupted. "No, it's true. Karen knocked it over this morning when she was pulling files. Darn carpet's been. I want to know what you found up there, and I want to know why everyone's acting like I'm crazy." William sighed and asked if I could hold for a moment. The phone beeped, and then he came in much clearer. "Had to take this in my office," he said. His voice softened to just above a whisper. "Look, Felix, I don't want any trouble with Faye's daddy. He's a good man, and I gotta see him a couple times a year. So whatever I tell you, you can't go telling around." "I won't say anything," I replied. "I just want to know what's going on." William cleared his throat. "I respect Greg, but I think you have a right to know, seeing as how y'all went through what you did. He wasn't lying about the break-in, only they didn't take anything. You know, I've been on this mountain for 18 years, and before that, I worked all over the Appalachians. I ain't ever seen anything that made me believe in ghosts, but I was weirded out up there yesterday." "What are you saying?" I asked, glancing up the stairs for any signs of Faye. "I'm trying to say I believe you," William responded. "I mean, I don't think any UFO's been touching down up there, but I believe that something happened. I don't think y'all are lying or crazy." "Tell me what you found." I tried to sit down on the couch, but immediately found myself standing again, nervously awaiting William's reply. "Well, we come up there about noon. My buddy and his son come with me. They live over the Indian reservation, other side of the mountain. Big hikers, helped us on a few search and rescues in the past. Cabin was fine outside, no smashed windows or nothing, but somebody's been in there. I don't know how." "How do you know?" I asked. Faye coughed upstairs. "I was in that bedroom with you when you were packing," he said. "Y'all had stuff in the closet. You only grabbed what you could. But I remember how that room looked when we left, and it wasn't like when we visited yesterday. Them clothes were all over the ground, some on the bed. like somebody was smelling them or maybe even trying them on. We also found some big black stains in the carpet, both in the living room and in the bedroom. It smelled ungodly. Still can't figure out how they got in. What do you mean they? William sighed again. My buddy found tracks outside in the snow, about a dozen of them, wandering all around like they were all lost, weren't going in no specific direction. Wandered up to the windows like they were trying to look in, back and forth into the woods over and over. He never saw nothing like it before. Couldn't explain it. My knees went weak and I finally felt like sitting. I dropped on the couch and rubbed the back of my neck. My hands were freezing. Pins and needles of anxiety climbed up my limbs. Is that it? I asked. Mostly, yeah, William said. A couple other things were odd. Silverware drawer was taken out and dumped all over the kitchen counters. Dirty dishes on the floor too, but none of them broken. Nothing stolen from the house, looks like. Not even the food. Maybe somebody was searching for something. I gotta tell you, kid, this one's got me stumped. A door opened upstairs and I heard footsteps across the ceiling. Faye was awake. Look, I ain't saying I believe much of this, William added, but there's a lot of old legends around the mountain, real old. Like what? I whispered, trying to keep Faye from overhearing. I now understood why Greg had lied to me. Neither of us wanted to scare her any further. Stuff about the old mines, people getting dragged deep into them, strange things coming out, stuff about spirits of the woods, things living up in them trees, crap like that. I don't know much more, but if you want to talk to my buddy, he'd probably be willing. I told him about the voices you heard in the other language, and he was real interested. He thinks he knows what it is. Did you tell them about the Dreamcatcher? I asked. We didn't find one, he said. I rushed to the kitchen and grabbed a pen. Okay, go ahead. Alright, so that's T-Way, and he's the father. Guy I've known a long time. Can you spell that? I asked. T-I-W-E. One of them little Frenchy flares in the I and the E. William gave me the number, and I quickly hung up just as Faye descended the stairs. She looked at me with a blank expression, almost as if she didn't recognize me, then smiled and walked past me to the refrigerator. For much of the day, Faye appeared to have returned to her cheerful and feisty self. She blared hard rock and danced around doing chores, occasionally winking at me and batting away my attempts to annoy her by pulling on her curls. When we were back home in Northern California, unpacking the few things we'd managed to grab during our escape from the cabin, our shared relief was palpable. We laughed and joked all afternoon. But as night settled in, I noticed a few odd things in Faye's mannerisms. We ordered a pizza and she wolfed down most of it, despite her common objection to greasy carbs. I chalked it up to her lack of appetite while she was sick, but I'd never seen her eat like this. She was absolutely ravenous, like a pregnant woman, or a wolf. Faye also began to grow anxious. The darker it got, the more on edge she appeared, until she abruptly suggested we not go to bed, but instead just watch a funny movie. When I resisted, she grabbed my hand and pulled me close to her, pretending to pout, and I could feel that she was trembling, so I agreed. She fell asleep in my arms about 15 minutes into Wedding Crashers, and twitched and jerked throughout its duration. The movie ended just before 1 a.m. It was only then, in the darkness and silence of the house, that I realized I felt very fearful about our experiences in the cabin. Each little sound outside tripped a wire in my brain, triggering flashes of creepy memories. I tried to remind myself that we were nearly 1,000 miles away from Pale Peak, safe at home and surrounded by watchful neighbors, but no amount of rationalizing could calm my nerves. My mind kept returning to the woman on my car and the man standing at the edge of the tree line, facing away from us and gazing up at the trees. Those images will be burned into my retinas forever. When the movie ended, I quickly snuck away from the couch to get a drink. As I passed the stairwell, a soft noise came from upstairs. It sounded a bit like a man sighing. I dismissed it as the heater, which occasionally whooshed and clanked, but hurried back to Faye and woke her up. She looked up at me with a puzzled expression, then glanced around the room. I had a weird dream, she said, touching my hand as I caressed her face. Oh yeah? I said. There was a man. Better looking than me. He was carrying something, she said, closing her eyes again. It was heavy. I offered to help him. But when I spoke, he ran away. Ran away from you? I said, tugging on a lock of her fiery hair. Why didn't I think of that? Because I only date dumb guys, she replied with a yawn. We both laughed. Weird dream, I added. After he was gone, I looked at it, Faye continued. It was a big bag, like a body bag. But when I opened it, it was just a bunch of snow and twigs and stuff. Huh. I stuck my hand inside, like there was something else in there, something underneath. I just knew. At this point, I was intrigued. Faye's dreams were often complex and metaphorical. Even when neither of us could understand them, I always got the sense that her dreams, even her nightmares, carried a deeper meaning. What'd you find? I asked. I never saw what it was. He woke me up before I could find out, you jerk. She laughed and pushed me away. We headed upstairs to brush our teeth and climbed into bed. Faye was out before her head even hit the pillow. I tossed and turned for a while, still a tad afraid to fall asleep. I had the irrational fear that I'd wake up back at the cabin, our escape having been only a desperate fantasy. What are you doing? Faye blurted out in the darkness. By the stilted way she spoke and the unusual tone of her voice, I knew she was sleep-talking. I rolled over and watched her face in the moonlight that filtered through the curtains above our bed. Her eyes were closed, but rolled all around in the lids. Do you want some help? She said. Perhaps she was reliving the dream from earlier this evening. I held my breath. Oh my gosh, what is this? I instinctively reached over and ran my fingers down the length of her arm. Being touched usually soothed Faye and helped to weaken the nightmare. Being touched, I like to think, reminded her on some subconscious level that I was nearby and that she was safe. She settled back down and mumbled a few more sentences, but there was nothing I could make out. In a few moments, Faye returned to peaceful sleep. I lay there for a long while, gazing into the softness of her face. The chaos lurking beneath those gentle features astonished me. If only I could know what plagued her thoughts in the murk of sleep. But the fleeting nature of dreams sometimes hindered her ability to recall them, and abruptly waking her guaranteed that they'd vanish like shadows hit with a flashlight. Whatever mysteries lay buried in Faye's head, they would not be unearthed through interrogation. At least not by me. Twice now, Faye had answered questions to someone else or something else in her sleep. I remembered the woman's voice outside the cabin, how it lit up with menacing glee when Faye replied to it. Had there really been a dark force on the mountain that still took unnatural interest in her? Was it still within us? Or was Faye simply talking to a dream of that memory, to a creation of her own mind? Anxiety and despair crept through my muscles, causing them to tense and twitch. I just need to sleep, I assured myself. We both do, lots of it. Eventually, I found a bit of rest. Faye laughed a few times and said the names of two of her coworkers, and this actually made me feel better. On a normal night, she babbles about mundane things and people from work, so hearing this sleep talk indicated that her mind had turned away from the dark dreams of the cabin. A new calm settled over me, and all went black. Much later, I floated up from a dream of grading papers. The first thing that came into focus was the alarm clock across the room. Its glow read 4:01 a.m. I tried to remember what day it was, thinking that the paper stack was due in a few short hours, but my thought was interrupted by a voice. Shh, yes, yes. It was Faye. She was whispering. I held perfectly still, feeling every hair on my neck bristle at the quiet words she spoke. Normally, Faye laughed, cursed, argued, and even shouted in her sleep, but in 5 years of sharing a bed with this woman, never once did I hear her whisper. Faye was lying on her side facing away from me and whispering one half of a very strange conversation. I imagined a person crouching in the darkness at the edge of the bed, smiling up at her and whispering back. It was impossible to make out much of what she said, but I thought I heard wolves beneath it down there, and not aloud. What are you saying, Faye? I asked, loud enough to wake her. She didn't respond. I reached over and nudged her. Who are you talking to? She jolted under my touch and whispered, Don't. Exhausted and annoyed, I yanked the sheets and rolled over, trying to get some rest. As sleep crept its way back to me, I imagined the man from outside the cabin, lying beneath our bed and staring up at the mattress in the dark. In my mind, he had a big grin plastered across his face. At about 5:45 a.m., I was awoken by Faye. My eyes cracked open just as she came into the bedroom. She walked stiffly, as if she had muscle cramps in both legs. Faye clambered back into bed and covered herself with blankets, making little effort not to wake me. Her green eyes were big and full, as though she'd been up for hours, and she stared right into mine for just a moment. Then she rolled over and faced away from me. The rhythm of her breathing was soft and shallow, like that of a sleeping person. This was another disturbing omen that something was wrong. Despite her tendency to babble in the middle of the night, Faye sleeps like a dead horse. A water glass already rested on her nightstand, so I assumed she hadn't gotten up to get something to drink. Our bathroom is connected to the bedroom, and she certainly hadn't come from there. The most likely explanation is that she'd been sleepwalking. This scared me, because I always worried that she'd fall down the stairs. But even then, Faye only sleepwalked a few times a year, and I usually saw it coming. I kicked myself for not having predicted that her current stress levels might precipitate an episode. I should have known. A fuzzy memory popped into my head. I thought I'd seen Faye returning to bed at about the same time in our last night at her parents' house in Colorado. I couldn't be sure it was real, but now I wondered how long Faye had been getting up and wandering around in the dark this early in the morning. Did she do it at the cabin? Everything about the past week was a blur. We woke up late the next morning. "Yo, Monkey Toes," I said, leaning out from the kitchen. Faye was reading something on her phone while I made us some eggs. "You remember anything from last night?" She replied, wiping her face with her hands. "I think his name was Brett or Brad or something, I don't know. I was pretty wasted." "Smart ass," I said. Faye burst into laughter, apparently satisfied with herself. "Why you asking, Pop-Tart?" she said. I told her everything I remembered from the last night, knowing that it could be a trigger of a chain reaction. Once Faye was aware that she was sleepwalking and experiencing other nocturnal disturbances, she tended to overthink it and cause more of them. To me, it was worth the risk. She was acting stranger than ever before, and I wanted to get to the bottom of it. Her constant disruptions to my sleep were beginning to drive me insane. "I don't remember any of that," she said, looking into my eyes with a joyless expression. I knew she wasn't lying, so I didn't press any further. Faye's work shift didn't start until the afternoon, so when she left, I had the place to myself all evening, and that time I decided to call Taway. I felt hesitant to reach out to him, even after William had assured me that I was alright. It was probably a reluctance to hear anything that would further terrorize my brain while lying in bed that night. It took some consideration, but eventually I picked up the phone. Taway picked up the first ring. "Felix," he answered in a dreary voice. "I foresaw this conversation in the dream." Hey," I replied, not knowing what to say to that. Taway let out a disarming laugh. I instantly got the sense that he was a nice guy. A friend. "Bad joke," he said. "Sometimes it's fun to play the part, for the tourists, you know." "That was good," I admitted, letting out an awkward laugh. "All those magazines and gift shops they have out there. I can see why visitors get the wrong impression." "The industry isn't really fair to us," Taway said. "We're not all shamans and wise men. In fact, we cuss and mess around and use Facebook almost like you humans." "Sorry," I replied. "I felt a little weird calling you, but that's one of the reasons. Is it wrong of me to ask you for help with whatever this is? Isn't it a bit like asking a random Chinese guy to teach me kung fu?" Taway laughed again. His voice was rich and textured, the kind you'd hear narrating a nature documentary. "Well, I guess if he's the one who offered it first." "Okay, in that case, it's nice to meet you. Can you make my fiancée stop doing satanic crap in her sleep?" We both cracked up. For the first time in days, I felt hopeful. "How's things?" he asked. "I've been meaning to call you, got your number from William a few days ago, but I figured I'd give you both some time to unwind." I filled Taway on what happened at the cavern and about Faye's unusual behavior since we left the place. The conversation became more and more grim as I proceeded down the list of disturbing things we'd experienced. Taway listened carefully and occasionally said, or "tell me more," but did not share any of his thoughts with me. He waited patiently and considered my every word. After 10 minutes of recounting the story, Taway finally spoke. "Felix, this sounds like a really strange situation. I understand why you're upset, and I'm sure what you guys went through would have given me a heart attack. Based on what William told me, I had some idea about what's going on, but now that I heard it from the horse's mouth, I want to talk to a few buddies of mine. Wise men, you know. Can you give me a few days, just to be sure? My heart sank on the request. I was hoping for a simple explanation for everything, but I appreciated that someone was willing to help at all. Sure thing, I said, trying to hide the disappointment in my voice. I just don't want to be wrong about this, he added. It sounds like you love your fiancée very much. Hold on to that. It will keep you both strong, should she get worse. What do you mean, worse? I asked. I've got to go now, Toei said, but I'll call you soon. Get some rest. The conversation left me with mixed feelings. On one hand, I felt better knowing that I wasn't alone in my quest for answers, but on the other, I feared that Toei was going to come back and tell me that Faye was possessed or some other crazy nonsense. I couldn't understand why she was the one who ended up with all the weird psychological problems from the trip. I was the idiot who almost touched the dream catcher, and who almost got dragged away into the forest. I went outside into the snow multiple times, exposing myself to God knows what. Maybe the difference was that Faye believed in the supernatural, the world behind the world. And I did not. Maybe her belief that the cabin is haunted was having a psychosomatic effect on her, causing her to feel sick, intruded upon, tainted. Maybe it was all in her head. Then, who was she talking to in her sleep? I heard voices up in that mountain. I didn't dream it. Somebody was out there, walking around in the freezing dark, calling out to my future wife. That night, I came up with a plan. I wanted to test my hypothesis that Faye had been getting up early and sneaking around for the past several days. I set my phone to buzz at 4:15 a.m. and placed it under my pillow. Then I went to bed before 9, hoping to get in a good few hours of sleep before the alarm went off. At least my insomnia is gone, I mused, at the brink of unconsciousness. An unfamiliar voice woke me up. I glanced around the room, trying to get my bearings, and I saw that it was just after midnight. A dry, raspy voice croaked a few things from nearby. At first, I thought there was someone on the floor or under my bed, so I jumped up and used my phone as a light. It took me a moment to realize that the voice was Faye's, and she was mimicking another person in her sleep. Just as she had done the night before, she was lying on her side, usually she sleeps on her tummy, facing away from me. She repeated the sounds la la la, as if she were trying to sing, but the words were robotic and monotonous. I could hear her tongue wagging around and flicking against her teeth between utterances, like she was testing a new mouth for the first time. Then Faye spoke a few phrases. Down in the hole. He's still up there. Where were you? I looked for you. Faye's voice had changed, but she wasn't channeling some otherworldly spirit. It was as if she was trying to imitate the person she was speaking to. It frustrated me that this person was in her head, in her dreams, and I could only ever hear one side of the conversation. I found myself beginning to hate this phantom of her mind. As I stood there clutching my phone, contemplating whether to wake her, there was a noise outside the bedroom window. It sounded like an old man grumbling to himself about something. The night was quiet and hardly any crickets sang, so I knew I hadn't imagined the noise. Whoever he was moving away from my house, muttering his frustrations under his breath as he went. Because I'm in a PhD program, Faye and I are able to live in a faculty house complex at the base of the campus. It's a quaint little set of neighborhoods, surrounded on 3 sides by a belt of redwoods. And there are small groves of trees, separating each neighborhood from the next. Our bedroom window overlooks the street in front of the house. Just across it rests one of those groves, and at night, a faint yellow light of houses in the adjacent neighborhood twinkle around it. They look a bit like fairies, floating in the dark. I left Faye and quietly pulled the curtain open, hoping to catch someone wandering around in front of the house. Instead, I saw the silhouette of a man, far off in the distance, meandering between the trees across the street. He'd never been visible if the houses behind him weren't lit up. Each time he passed in front of one, his huge form eclipsed the yellow lights, providing me with momentary glimpses of his body. He must have been nearly 7 feet tall, and shuffled awkwardly, like a drunken person. Thank you so much, Google. Sorry about that. Oh my goodness. Apparently Dream is live, so guess what I'll be watching after this. 1,000 hairs pricked up on my arms as I stared out the window. The longer I watched, the more bizarre the man seemed. Suddenly he stopped in his tracks and turned around. His body was a featureless black mass, so I couldn't tell if he was facing toward or away from me. Then he lurched to step past the tree line. The moon lit him up just enough to reveal he was wearing a ragged jacket. His back was turned to me, and his head was tilted straight up at the sky. He paused there for only a moment, then retreated into the darkness of the woods and disappeared. Dang, yeah. That scared me, my goodness. I scanned the tree line, trying to spot any disruptions in the lights beyond it, but there was nothing. The man had vanished. Because I'd opened the curtain, pale moonlight now poured into the bedroom. I turned back toward the bed, trembling with fear, and nearly shrieked when I saw Faye. She was lying there on her back, with her neck craned out toward me, head upside down, and dangling off the side of her bed. The wide, crazed eyes locked onto me and her mouth hung open. She issued a gurgling, drawn-out groan and flicked her tongue around, prompting me to back up to the window frame and nearly climb up the wall. Her movements looked like an epileptic fit in slow motion. Faye watched me with malice I'd only seen in movies. Her eyes pierced into mine with hateful desire and never broke from their assault. They seemed to drag me down into them, where I'd be swallowed up forever. Faye had opened her eyes while sleepwalking in the past, but never like this. Nothing human remained in her gaze now. I was staring into the eyes of a wolf, and they looked up at me with a terrifying glee. She seemed to recognize me, but not in the way that two people who live in the same house recognize each other. It was as though I'd been missing 1,000 years, and she'd finally found me. The fear that gripped me mutated into an acute rage. I strode toward Faye and bellowed her name, shattering the nightmare's hold on her. She went limp for a moment, while her brain rebooted. Then she clawed her way out of the ungodly position she'd bent herself into and pulled herself back onto the pillows. Her eyes blinked repeatedly until a rabid hunger in them subsided. "Felix?" she asked. Fear anchored her voice, so only whispers escaped her mouth. "Please tell me you remember what you just dreamed," I said, sitting down next to her. I glanced once more at the window, but I couldn't see the tree line from where I sat. Faith threw her arms around me and buried her face in my chest. "I was walking. It was dark." "What did you see? Do you know where you were?" She paused for a moment, then turned her head out toward the window. "Out there." I felt the hair on my arm stand up again. "I think it's time for another doctor's appointment," I replied, trying to exhale the wave of dread that rose in my chest. Faye nodded, seemingly afraid to take her eyes off me. I wrapped my arms around her and held her close, trying to ensure her that she didn't feel alone in the struggle. Faye was engaged in some internal conflict, and the war that was being waged across her subconscious. Fear and revulsion rose within me, but I reminded myself that she was my future wife. My devotion required that I be there for her no matter what, even if I didn't yet know how to help. After some time, the pounding in her heart slowed, and her heavy breathing fell away to a calm rhythm. Her grip on me loosened, and she drifted off into the mysterious world of her dreams, to where I so desperately wanted to follow. In all the commotion, I'd forgotten about my alarm. My phone scared the heck out of me when it vibrated under my pillow at 4:15 a.m. By the time I realized what was going on, I had already blurted out a string of curses and nearly woken Faye up. I hobbled to the bathroom. When I returned, I saw Faye burying her teeth up at the ceiling and gently caressing her face with her hand. As I stared at her through the darkness, a part of me feared she'd suddenly bite off her own fingers as they dragged across her lips. Eventually, her arms flopped back down on the bed. I sunk down into the old armchair that occupied the corner opposite our bed. It was an ancient thing, discovered by Faye at a garage sale. It was now essentially a clothes rack, and it was uncomfortable enough that I knew I wouldn't fall back asleep. I waited quietly in the dark for a half hour, fixated on my sleeping fiancé and the strange movements she made. Every so often she'd twitch, or reach toward the ceiling, or mumble something unintelligible, but I remained silent, wondering if she'd validate my suspicions that she'd been getting up in the wee hours to skulk around the house. Around 5 a.m., my eyelids hung heavy and my limbs tingled due to the awful chair. I stood up and stretched, ready to abandon my mission and crawl back into bed. Suddenly, Faye drew a sharp breath. She jolted straight up out of bed, back stiff, and stared into the darkness before her. A mess of tangled curls cascaded down her face and obscured it, but she appeared to be looking around the room. I felt the words, "Faye, are you okay?" well up inside my mouth. Before I could blurt them out, she tossed her sheets from the lower body and swung her legs over the side of the bed. She planted wobbly feet on the carpet one at a time and stood, teetering back and forth, then rose onto the balls of her feet. She tilted her head back and forth a few times as if to empty water from her ears, then tiptoed across the bedroom and pulled the door open with a gnarled hand. Her movements were not cute and clumsy, like those of a sneaky child on Christmas Eve. They were robotic, inhuman. She moved down the hall like a meth-addicted zombie ballerina and stopped at the stairwell. Her breathing remained delicate and hypnotic. I paused at the doorway, watching Faye's alien movement. She stood at the top of the stairs, peering down into the abyss, whispering something I couldn't make out. She remained high up on the balls of her feet, every muscle in her body pulled taut until her form was stiff as death. The moon peeked through the nearby window, illuminating her from behind. I cast her figure in a ghostly glow, adding to the illusion of an old corpse stalking around my house. Faye slid her fingers over her face for 2 or 3 minutes. It almost looked like she was learning about her own appearance for the first time. She ran a hand over the banister, then the wall, and flicked on the light switch on and off in patterns of 5. All the while, she maintained her perfectly mechanical breathing. In my mind, I saw her collapse and fall down the stairs. I wanted to hurry to her side and wake her up before my vision became reality, but a cocktail of fright and morbid curiosity rooted me to the floor. I looked on as she moved through her disturbing performance. Faye reached an arm out, stretching and wiggling her fingers. Then she closed her hand and pulled it back up to her face in roughly the motion of a bicep curl. She repeated this behavior for about a minute, and I had the idea she was testing the limb, as though she'd never used it before. However, after seeing her lips move again, I realized that she was communicating with someone at the bottom of the stairs. Someone in the dark. Faye was making a come-hither motion, enticing whoever it was to come up the stairs with us. Recalling the man I'd seen wandering around outside, I strode over to the bedroom and leaned over the half wall that overlooks the first floor. It was so dark down there that I couldn't see anything but the glow of the clock on the cable box. Beside me, Faye stood there waving, smiling, and touching her face and hair. I gently wrapped an arm around her waist and flipped the light on, blinding myself in the process. She went limp at my touch as if released from a magic spell, and nearly sent us both tumbling down the stairs, onto the tile floor at the bottom. I ushered her back to the hall, and spoke as softly as I could, trying not to fully wake her. As with every other time I discovered her sleepwalking around the house, Faye offered no resistance, and climbed back into bed without so much as a mumble. A part of me felt silly for doing it, but I searched the entire bottom floor of the house and found no one. I now had to admit that I could not before. Whatever it was that had found us at the cabin had followed us home. That morning, Faye woke up looking terrible. Dark rings circled her eyes, and a deathly pallor had fallen on her skin. She was clammy to the touch, and if not for her ravenous appetite, I would have thought she'd come down with the flu. After about 10 phone calls, we landed a same-day doctor's appointment. When I notified Faye of it, she hardly looked up from the giant omelet she'd made for herself. "Dr. Arvada's gonna fax your blood work over to this one," I said, squeezing her shoulder as I passed by. "Maybe something's changed. You okay with some more tests?" I circled the table and sat across from her. "Mm-hmm," she grunted. "You never eat eggs," I said. It was more of a question than a statement. She paused for a moment, then continued shoveling forkfuls into her mouth. Pieces of onion fell from her lips as she did. I looked closer. It was just eggs with onion. Too much onion. Faye barely spoke during our drive to the appointment. She answered a few of my questions with one-word responses, but remained disconnected and listless. She watched the world rush by as the car moved, but I couldn't be sure she was even seeing anything. I made a few comments that I would normally prompt her to reply with a dumb joke. Things like, "Man, I'm so sore," and "I couldn't sleep at all last night." but Faye never took the bait. At the hospital, we were greeted by a man named Dr. Farmer. He was older, with salt and pepper hair that looked uncombed for a century. His cheerful demeanor and sincere interest in Faye's health seemed to coax her out of her shell, and after a few minutes he actually got her to crack a smile. As I recounted Faye's unusual sleepwalking incidents, the doctor made exaggerated reactions of pretend shock and horror. This elicited a few giggles from Faye, and she eventually began speaking in full sentences again. Dr. Farmer's playfulness, combined with his rather small stature, made him appear more like a cartoon character or a hobbit than a medical professional. But as soon as I mentioned the creepy sleep-talking, his conduct changed, and the gaiety fell away. "Tell me about your dreams," he said, yanking a stethoscope from his ears and dropping onto the stool in front of her. She stared into his little blue eyes for a long moment, hesitant to share, and then said, "Someone's trying to talk to me." "Who?" "I don't know." "Do you see this person, or just hear a voice?" "It's foggy, hard to remember. I always forget what he looks like, but I saw him a few times. He never looks right at me." The two spoke for a few more minutes, drawn into a conversation about the significance of dreams and whether they reveal anything about the state of our minds. They carried on as if I were not even in the room. Suddenly, Dr. Farmer looked at me and said, "Mr. Blackwell, do you mind if I speak to Faye alone?" I felt stunned and a little put off, but I understood the importance of his request. If somehow I were the cause of Faye's recent psychological issues, she might be unwilling to speak openly with the doctor. I glanced over at her as I left the room. She returned a little smile to me. When Dr. Farmer opened the door a few minutes later, he was cheerful again. I felt a warm hand on my back as I passed by him into the room. "Well, my boy," he said, ushering me into an empty chair beside Faye. "I was just telling this young lady that I'd like for her to see a psychologist if these dreams persist for more than a few days." "You mean like for a psychiatric evaluation?" I asked. Faye and I exchanged worried looks. "Oh yes," he said, eyes widening in terror. "This one's out of her mind." Faye laughed. My face went a bit warm. She hadn't laughed at anything I'd said all morning. Lol, loser. "Nothing official," he replied, then looked at Faye. "I just think you could benefit from talking to someone more extensively about these dreams. Get down to the root, you know. That's the thing about strange dreams and sleepwalking and so forth. They're like smoke. The fire's even deeper. And as fascinating as I find yours, Miss Spencer, I'm no expert on nightmares." The doctor prescribed Faye a mild sedative to ensure she got a full night's sleep, and started her on a short course of anti-anxiety medication to see if it helped calm her nerves. He surmised that Faye was dealing with some kind of trauma, and suggested that we spend some time outside to clear her head. We accepted the suggestion and a referral to the psychologist, if the medications failed, and then went home. As we left the office, Dr. Farmer poked his cherubic head into the receptionist's area and called out to Faye, "Write them down. Spend some time on it." For the remainder of the day, Faye was in better spirits. She went right back to teasing me and joking around as usual, and even agreed to go on a little nature walk on the trails near our house. We grabbed her meds from the pharmacy on the way home, then suited up for the walk. It was about 3 p.m., so we planned to be outside for only an hour. In the redwoods, it gets dark as soon as the sun dipped behind the treetops, and this time of year, that's just after 3. Faye came trotting down the stairs in a curve-hugging gym outfit. I pulled her in for a kiss, but she nipped at me playfully and shoved me away. I was relieved to see the fire in her eyes again. It was that fire that I'd fallen in love with, the one that occasionally burned me. She grabbed her water bottle and flung the door open, signaling for me to follow. Outside, we crossed the neighborhood through the trails. The walk required us to cut through the line of trees where I'd seen the dark figure the night before. I tried not to alert Faye to what I was doing, but she noticed me periodically gazing up into the trees and scanning around us. "This place," she said. "I had a dream about it last night." Her remark pulled me out of a memory of the figure. Faye stopped in her tracks and turned around, facing back to our neighborhood. "What do you remember?" I asked. "I was just standing here," she said. "Just watching." She pointed a finger into the distance. A few hundred feet away, our little bedroom window was visible. "Do you know why? What were you doing all the way out here?" "I don't know, but someone was watching me back from our window." "Was it me?" I asked. I needed to dance around the subject. I didn't want to divulge to Faye that I'd seen a man slinking around out here in the middle of the night. That night I got up and looked outside, heard a noise. Faye studied the window, deep in thought. Not you. Someone else. He was all dark. He watched me for a while. Was it the man from your dream at the cabin? The one digging the hole? It felt like him. Did he talk to you? I took a step toward her and put my hands on her arms. The symphony of songbirds died away, leaving us alone in the murky shadows of the redwoods. No, Faye said. He turned around and looked down at you. He stood over you while you slept. It was only in this moment that I realized how cold the air felt, but it wasn't just the breeze that chilled me. It was the similitude of her dream to what I had seen through the window while she slept. What did you do? I pressed, squeezing her arms a bit tighter. Faye tilted her head back and drew a long breath. I turned away. I was so scared, and then I looked up. She opened her eyes toward the treetops. They darted around for a moment, then locked onto something. Faye gasped and her knees buckled. I stumbled to catch her. We stumbled together, but I managed to catch her before we fell over. What is it? I asked, clutching onto her and frantically searching the canopy. I feel like I'm going to pass out. Her face went pale again. Let's go home. I need to go home. Faye held onto my arm with both hands as we headed back toward the house. Right as we exited the little grove, she stopped and looked over her shoulder. You hear that? She asked. Hear what? Thought I heard a little boy. He was singing. Okay, we're gonna stop here because we're coming up on an hour, so we're gonna go back over to our fun music. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this stream. We got more into the story today, so yeah, we're really getting into it. That'll be the last Stolen Tongues reading until I get back from my break, so yeah. We're going to see if there's any friends that we can read today. But while I'm doing that, if you guys are watching on YouTube, if you enjoyed, please consider subscribing. It takes 2 seconds and it's completely free. So you can always unsubscribe later. Nobody is streaming today, so we are just going to wrap it up. Again, thank you so much for watching. And I'll see you guys tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern for some Counterside. Alright, we'll see you then, guys. Bye!